One of the things we hear a lot from caregivers is there are no experts that I can turn to. So I have to become the expert myself. How are we facilitating that in a way that's manageable for them based off of the different levels of health literacy that different sub communities have? So it's all of those things. It's getting to the crux of what they're really looking for, what's really helpful for them, and not just what we want them to know, right? Based off of our communication objective for a specific product.
Right.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia,
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast series that takes the BS out of behavioral science for marketers and non-marketers alike. We hope to arm you, our listeners, with the tools you need to make sense of behavioral science and to help you apply it to your work as communication extraordinaires. Today, we are joined by a lovely guest, and I'm going to get into introductions. But today's episode, we're going to be talking about rare diseases. And February 29th is actually Rare Disease Day. It's the rarest day. It only comes out once every 4 years. But the day is actually, it was created to help generate change, raise awareness, and provide support for those in the rare disease community, both patients, their caregivers, and providers as well. Globally, about 300 million people have a rare disease. And in the US, about 1 in 10 have a rare disease, whether it's diagnosed or undiagnosed, they're being treated for it or not. So that's a definitely significant number. So today we are joined by Havas's very own Afshan Rizvi Hussain, who is our rare disease lead globally. This is a new position for her, but we are so happy to have her. She's really dedicated 20 years of her career to serving the rare disease community and doing some amazing work, which we are going to get into. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Thanks so much for having me.
Let's jump right into the conversation. We have a lot to cover and there's so much to say. So let's start with a question. A quote that we hear a lot in the rare disease space is, when you hear hooves, think horses, not zebras. Can you expand on this quote and any thoughts you have regarding it?
Yeah, it's so interesting when you think about in healthcare how physicians are taught to do a differential diagnosis, right? So it's the thing that you see most often is probably the thing that it is. And we do that for a multitude of reasons, right? It's what majority of folks are, out of sight, out of mind. It's majority of what you're going to see, but it's also to streamline the efforts of the healthcare community. But 1 in a million, you get that zebra. And it's the reminder that sometimes when you think it's a horse, it might not be. And don't always assume that the sound of the hooves is really just for the horses. It's sort of a mantra for the rare disease community that the zebra stripes are a visual symbol of how they come together to remind the healthcare community that there's some zebras out there too. It's not always horses.
Yeah, I love that. And I think a conversation that Brad and I were having earlier was just, the origin of this quote and how, in medical students and when you're getting your degree, you're kind of taught to think horses because you don't automatically want to fall into recency bias where you read about something really, rare and then you see a patient and you're like, well, this must be it. And then as you sort of evolve in your career within doctoring and you become a specialist or what have you, you really have to start relying on your experience and kind of move away from that thinking to honoring that, it might be in fact a zebra.
it's horses or zebras or turtles or whatever,
Yeah.
right? I was talking to Saketu Patel, who's the chief medical officer, and we both kind of agree that phrase, think horses, not zebras, is very useful when you are a medical student.
Yeah.
When you are early in your career, because as Ketsu pointed out, and I've seen it too, like if you're a resident and you just diagnosed 4 rare diseases overnight, you probably did not see 4 rare diseases overnight.
Sure.
And so it is that sort of recency bias where you've got a student whose nose is deep in a book, or they want to, they've seen House on TV and they want to be the guy who sort of diagnoses the really hard thing. It's a dysfunctional phrase when you get further into your career because you start not trusting. I've seen 10,000 children. This one seems different, but I'll pretend it's a horse. That's not useful. I think in the rare disease community, the complaint would be like, zebras are out there. And the more we don't look for them, or the more we pretend we don't see them, the longer it takes to get to the community and the treatment and the diagnosis. The diagnosis is the first step. And that's often seen as like this very transformational moment in the patient and family, because it's the family journey. So yeah, think horses and zebras is what we should be telling people a few years into practice. It makes sense, but yeah.
Right. But you made a good point about experienced healthcare professionals. Even the most experienced might not ever see a patient with a specific rare disease. They might see one. And if you've never seen a zebra, how are you going to recognize one?
Mhm.
It's tricky. Low probability, high consequence events are something that's very difficult for us to sort of get our heads around. And the busier we make doctors, right, the more we focus on throughput, the more efficient we become at missing difficult rare diagnoses. So I think, speed is not the only goal in medicine. It's value. It's how do we see as many patients as we can and give them good care, because I can see a lot of patients quickly if I just don't give them very good care. So it's really been that balance of, is the juice worth the squeeze, sometimes, as people say. And I think what's transforming rare disease is we've got more and more and more treatments. So it's absolutely worth diagnosing. So, I mean, we'll get into all of this, but I think the more we talk about it, the more it's like it's horses and zebras and every other animal in the zoo, not to compare humans to animals. But if the diseases are animals and we're stratifying them by rarity, it really should be, we should stratify them by importance. And we should be looking for not a rare disease, but overall rare diseases. Is that a fair statement?
I think when it's not a horse, and what I mean by that is when a patient is not feeling like they've been heard and seen and
Right.
their needs have been addressed, it's time to look for zebras.
So something, as if you listen to the podcast, I'm a linguist. I'm always very interested in the language, and it's not unusual in an era of rapid transformation, driven by technology, for the language not to keep up, right? So I say this all the time. The things we carry in our pockets are not phones, they're pocket supercomputers. We call them phones because they evolved out of phones. But actually, if we called them pocket supercomputers, we'd probably treat them slightly differently. So I do think the language matters. And I think for me, rare disease in and of itself is an interesting sort of phrase, because it's not really a disease the way we think of pathology that enters from outside of you. You haven't caught something. And is it really all that rare if there's 300 million people? It just depends on how we classify it. Each one might only have a few or a few hundred or a few thousand or a few tens of thousand sufferers. But the idea that rare diseases are genetically driven, that's not rare. That's everyone. It's just some of them have more pathology than others. So, I think the language even itself.
I think there's power in the lexicon that we've
Yeah.
created for the rare disease community. And it's similar to a lot of other marginalized or minority communities where you have a smaller group
Right.
that you identify with. So maybe if we use rare disease as the example, it's like a genetic mutation, you find other people with that, but it's so hard to find that. So you try to find the larger groups that you can have some sort of affinity with. And the same way we have like BIPOC communities, right,
Right.
that are made of smaller groups. We have the rare disease community. And I love NORD, the National Organization for Rare Disorders. Their slogan is, "Alone we are rare, together we are strong." And that's such a great representation of why it's important to bring all of these sub-communities together and celebrate them on a day like Rare Disease Day, to really understand that, sure, there might be 1 in a million in a specific disease, but altogether, 300, if you have context of 300 million, the population of the United States is about 320 million. So think about that. It's a country's worth of people
Right.
are
A
affected
big
by rare
countries.
disease.
Worth of
Big
people.
countries.
So Spain's like 38 million
Yeah.
people, right? So it's like 10 Spains or something like that.
Right.
It's a lot of people. And, first of all, it's not rare if you have it, right? Like that's always struck me throughout my journey in medicine, studying practice. You can be the one doctor on earth who treats something. It's not rare to you. It's the person you look in the
Right.
mirror every day. And it's the same for people on the other side who are receiving treatment. Like, it doesn't help anybody to hear that they have something that nobody's ever seen before. It sort of underscores that nobody knows what to do. And that's not true. It's the people in front of you who don't know what to do. But I think that's why the community aspect is so incredibly important, emotionally, intellectually, also just in terms of like health and outcomes, like getting around people who know what you need and who know what's available and who can put you in contact with the right treaters, the right situations is really the start of a different journey. And if you look at the journeys of these patients, I'm telling you something you already know, right? Like it starts with confusion and terror, and that chapter ends when you get diagnosed. And then begins the chapter of learning, of joining, of control in some ways over your own destiny, because at least you know what to call it. So to me, naming something is so powerful.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing to think about once I have the words of what I have, what's the immediate human reaction? Let me find someone else who has the same thing. So imagine you are one in a million, the likelihood of you finding someone else. Just having the name doesn't give you all the answers. So you're looking for other people, and you know that your physician, we just talked about HCP experience, unless they're in a center of excellence or if they're a key opinion leader, they don't necessarily have the experience. They don't know what to say to the patient about what to expect or how to cope. So they're looking for other people. Again, that's human nature. We do that. We're all reading Amazon reviews to get a sense of how to use a product. Of course, I'm
Yeah.
going to seek out other people who can help me understand my disease better if my physician can't do that. So when you can't find that, it's an incredibly frustrating dynamic. So seeking, like you were talking about learning, it's not just it's learning about your disease, but it's also seeking out others that can relate to you and maybe offer you some support along the way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think and that kind of brings me into, we're going to talk about communities, but something that, a role that's really important in the rare disease space, it's important in every space, but we think about HCP and patient, but the caregiver parent role within rare disease is something that always interested me because they're going through their own experience and it's a big part of it for many reasons, which I'll have you get into. But I remember when we were chatting about this episode, you had mentioned the difference between someone saying, I inherited my
Mhm.
rare disease versus I received it. And I think even in that terminology, there's an interesting discussion to be had, specifically from the viewpoint of the parent. Let's say the caregiver is the parent, because I know there's a lot of guilt in the space of giving care for someone with the rare disease, because you might feel like, well, they inherited it from me, or, they inherit it from my partner, and that causes familial tension. So we see, the hardship of caregivers in many different disease categories, but I think it's a really interesting and important conversation to be had in this one.
Yeah, that's an incredibly meaningful example for me, and I'll share that anecdotally, but it goes back to what you were speaking about for the lexicon
Yeah.
that they create for themselves. It's so important. So I was at one of the Nord conferences, I want to say maybe 2 years ago, and it was the first time I heard a patient, they were sharing about their experience, and they said, I, as a disease recipient, and I had never heard anyone use that phrase before. And we of course it was a flag, like, oh, or should we be talking about the community differently? That's a really important thing in rare disease. You're always asking, what can we do differently? Proximity to the community,
Right.
learn their language. How are they talking about themselves? So we can have the conversation with them and not be speaking at them. So of course, I'm immediately thinking, should we be changing the way that we're identifying inherited diseases? And when we probed a little bit more, we found out it was exactly that. They just didn't want to place blame on the people that they inherited the disease from. And like you said earlier, everyone inherits some sort of genetic something or other, right? It's just it's heavier for these folks whose health is negatively impacted.
Yeah. And we're all married, right? So, and we all have
Not
kids.
to each other.
Not to each other. That would be illegal. But we all have spouses and we all have kids. And like, I will just say that we blame each other for all sorts of things. Like, I have terrible eyes. The number of times my wife has said, and you're the reason they all have classics, right? So it is something where you take the rough with the smooth, right? You inherit your father's chin, but you also inherit your father's eyes or something like that. I think they're similar, but to your point, it's not the same as, it's much heavier to say like they inherited something that's life-threatening, life-altering, like glasses are a pain, but it's nothing compared to some of the diseases that we're talking about. We have a solve, so I do think there's some guilt, but I also think there's some, it's important to reframe it and make it something that like, it doesn't actually matter what drove this. What matters is the future.
Well, it doesn't stop at guilt. That's a really great example. But imagine this married couple that the two recessive genes come together,
Right.
Mhm.
and that's why a child is sick. So imagine they think to themselves, if I had only chosen a different spouse.
Mhm.
Right.
What a challenging dynamic for two married people to think through. And then what's the next step? Genetic counseling. What if we want another child?
Yeah.
So the thought process of, can we handle this? Will we be able to, it's a quote unquote risk
It
to
is.
try and have another child. And what if they end up with the same disorder? So all of those things that are happening psychologically on top of having to deal with the healthcare management for the child.
It's interesting you bring that up because that expression, low probability, high consequence events, I actually picked up from another linguist who's heavily involved in genetic counseling.
Mm.
And she was the one who pointed out to me that we really aren't very good at handling low probability, high consequence events, like a terrorist attack on an airplane. You either stop flying or you go, it's not going to happen, because there's no meaningful action you can take to stop somebody from blowing up your plane other than doing what the TSA tells you or something like that. So we, as humans, or you're the behavioral specialist, right? As humans, we tend to think yes or no. It's going to happen. It's not going to happen. So for events that are potentially catastrophic, but very rare, what do you do?
Yeah.
You know, what do you do if you've got a 1 in 10,000 chance of having a child with a devastating birth defect?
And-
I don't know that we have a mechanism for understanding 1 in 10,000. Right?
Right.
Try flipping a coin 10,000 times. You'd go 100 and you'd call it a day. So
Yeah. And I think something that we talk about a lot on the podcast is, the functional versus the psychological or emotional. And I think as in our role as communication experts, strategists, our job is to provide communication solutions. And a lot of times we look at, okay, well, what do they functionally need? Like what does this caregiver need from a support standpoint, like more practically and not emotionally. And I know that's not always in our remit, but it's important to think about, right? And I think that's what it means to do meaningful work in this space. How should we be considering the emotional more in the work that we're actually able to influence?
That is such a great topic. One of the important things is for us, and we talked a little bit about this, is to understand what they're seeking
Mhm.
and not what we want them to know. I mean, the work that we do is usually based around a treatment.
right.
And sometimes that's not what they need.
Right.
They'll have the basics about the treatment. And, if it's a first and only, then sure, they understand. But what they really are looking for us to communicate to them, we won't know unless we give them a seat at the table. It's that we talk about co-creation in rare disease all the time.
Right.
If we're not sitting with the community, and it can't be just one member of the community, you can't just have one person review a brochure that you already created and expect them to represent an entire community of people. It's the making sure that we have the language that is helpful for them, but also the topics
Yeah.
and the support and understanding the access barriers that they're facing. Sometimes we'll create something around treatment, but really the number one barrier for a caregiver is they're just not sleeping at night.
Right.
They can't function. One of the things we hear a lot from caregivers is there are no experts
Mhm.
that I can turn to. So I have to become the expert myself. How are we facilitating that in a way that's manageable for them based off of the different levels of health literacy that different sub communities have? So it's all of those things. It's getting to the crux of what they're really looking for, what's really helpful for them, and not just what we want them to know
Right.
based off of our communication objective for a specific product.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And I think, we talked a lot about community leading up to this example, this podcast, this episode. And I think that's something that I'm very passionate about. And many anthropologists are like, what do we mean by community? And having an online FAQ is not a community. It's useful, but communities have norms, they have standards, they have vocabulary, they have shared experiences. So for example, one thing you can learn by looking at online communities around health is what matters to the community enough that it has actually a name, right? So the talk in English is typically the sex talk, right? We just had the talk with the kids or the birds and the bees or something. But if you start looking at an Alzheimer's community online, children of patients with Alzheimer's, the talk is how do I get the keys from my dad or my mom so they can stop driving? Which is an incredibly challenging moment. And so you'll see people together in this community going, I remember one that really struck me. It's like, how do I get the keys and the guns from my dad? Sort of ups the ante, right? And you go, and everybody's having the same problem, and they all had different advice, but then they also all said, "Let me know how it goes." partly for emotional support. We wish you luck, you know,
Right.
but also, did it work, right? And that has all the hallmarks of something called a community of practice, which is something that sociologists were very interested in and educators were very interested in the 70s. How do we create a learning model that doesn't have failure baked in? Because you've got A's, you have F's. What's a learning model that people use that everyone's going to get there in their own time? And apprenticeships are one way of thinking about it. Everybody, the three of us become apprentice tailors. We'll all get there. Afshan's better than I am. So she goes faster. I get stuck at pants, but she goes on the jackets, whatever. But the idea is eventually you'll get there. That's a community of practice. It's a group learning together how to be better at something they want to be better at. And in some ways, it's professional formation. So you can almost look at these communities as helping parents, caregivers, sufferers themselves become more professionalized in the management of their own disease. And when you look at the community that way, our role is not to go in and teach them anything. They're teaching each other. Our role is to go in and listen, to understand their needs, to understand the language that they're using, and where possible to support them in their journey. We actually do know a way of doing this, community, or the answer could be this. To your point, the solution here is this. But to assume that we know the answers to something that we are not involved in when there's an entire robust online and offline community is missing the boat, I think, entirely in many ways. So that would be my thought around, as an anthropologist of these communities, is they're very real. They have a lot in common with physical communities. We've learned that since the dawn of the internet. And we can learn the same things we learn when we study an unstructured community going into the Amazon or whatever. I'm not trying to other them. I'm just saying, like, when you study a community you don't know, there are certain steps you take observing them. To your point, you don't talk to one person, because the one person who's willing to talk to you may very well be the one person who doesn't have a job all day because they're completely dysfunctional. That's one of the problems of anthropology. You walk into a village, the person talking to you is the only person who doesn't have a job to do, right? So you're actually talking to the one outsider, and then you have to work your way into the community a little bit. The internet at least gives us a chance to see what matters to the community. I'm not saying break into closed communities, but a lot of this stuff's online. You can just read it. Nobody's hiding. They're telling you, we need to find out how to get better care, how to get better support, how to get better things. So I'll get off my soapbox and try to break in, but it is an interesting sort of community dynamic.
Yeah, I mean, there's different layers
Yeah.
to the community. There are closed groups, like you said, and we have to respect those. Those are private spaces. Those are safe spaces where they
Legally,
can talk about.
ethically,
Yeah.
in every way, we have to
Right.
respect that. Yeah.
But there are also open online forums, and there are sub-communities. What's interesting is that they'll form around disease, sure, but then they also form around treatment.
Yeah.
But then the trend that I've seen in the last 5 to 10 years is they form around need. So you'll see social groups. We talked about online versus offline. So you'll have offline groups where they get together so
Yeah.
that the children can have friends who are similar to them, or the caregivers can have someone to talk to, right? So they'll find social groups that meet offline. But then online, they also have communities that share symptom management tips. And one of the interesting things is when some of these patients go to their doctor and they're not getting what they need from the doctor, where are they going next? The other people in their social community, and they'll give each other advice that help them find a
Right.
better doctor for
Right.
for their disease.
Yeah.
Or they'll give them tips. Well, when I went to my doctor, I brought XYZ test result, I brought XYZ document that I printed, and I found it online. So they help prepare each other to have those stronger conversations.
Right.
And then we see the other, like, advocacy groups that are maybe more policy focused.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that I'm so impressed by with this community. They identify the needs, and then they form, it's like a task force that
Yeah.
just go and fill the voids that they don't see other people filling. I just saw an article about, there was a patient in Hawaii. There were no specialists she had IgA nephropathy, no specialists in Hawaii. So she lobbied to get licensing for physician specialists in other states so that they could practice in Hawaii, telemedicine.
Yeah.
So she'd have somebody who actually could treat her disease. How impressive is that?
That's amazing.
And
Yeah.
think about the number of people that she's helping, that they're finally going to be able to get the care that they need.
I think it is amazing. And I think the internet, for all, yesterday was the day that the various bazillionaires were sort of taken to task for allowing the internet to become this very toxic thing to children. but it also has been very empowering. Like any tool, it's really how you choose to use it. And since the dawn of the internet, it has been used by people who feel alone or isolated to find other people like them. I'm talking about back when Usenets were things. So I mentioned Usenets to Sanika. She was like, what's that? So that made me feel very old. The old like chat rooms almost that didn't even have like the dawn of internet stuff. Even then, rare disease communities were forming around these very clunky things. And in fact, the chair of the Department of Linguistics at Georgetown is a woman named Heidi Hamilton. She's written articles because she had a child who had a very rare disease. And she was very interested. This is like in 1992 or 3. She was very interested in the relationship of those communities. Do they act like offline communities? She's a sociolinguist, so she's very interested in sort of community norms and how people talk. She was like 100%. Every question she asked sort of tracked to what we know happens in real online communities, teenagers, sports teams, ethnic groups, religious groups, whatever. They start to talk the same way. They start to value the same things. So these communities are unbelievably powerful. It does seem to be a human need, like you said, to find people who are like us. If you've ever been in a foreign country and you hear your language, it brings a smile to your face and your ear, and it sort of tickles your brain in a certain way. And so I do think we don't give enough credence to the importance of the support they get. But to Sanika's point, it's functional as well as emotional, as well as educational,
Right.
as well as all these sort of things. And then you create power. If you look at how the HIV community, the AIDS community during gay men's health crisis and things like that in New York, it's still an organization to this day, that very strong advocacy can come out of people seeking each other out and then collectively working to find solutions. So I think it's an incredibly transformative time right now in the rare disease space with the medicines that you've been mentioning and with the technologies we have for people to meet.
Yeah.
It's an entirely different experience than say 30 years ago. It's night and day. So.
And I think another really important aspect, and you sort of started touching on it with understanding communities from our lens and the work that we do. We talk about all the time, we have this information, we have access. Sometimes we don't know how to interpret what the important parts of it are to look at, and then how to apply it. And I think when we go into these communities and we do social listening and things like that, it's how do they think, how do they feel about treatment? How do they feel about their disease? But it's also being able and given the opportunity to understand their complete ecosystem. And we kind of spoke about that, like what's their life beyond just the way that they're interacting with the treatment or the way that they're not like living with their disease, but what else in their life is important to them. And that's also a way in and a really meaningful impact that we can have. So it's being able to social listen in the right way and pick up the things that really matter. Because I feel like so many times we do work, we have like these social listening efforts, and then it's like the output, it just feels like it's not enough to really understand them to the depth that we should be.
Yeah, I think again, the nature of what we do, we focus on clinical outcomes.
Yeah.
And this is a space where we have learned time and time again that it's not the most important thing in the way that we measure it, right? So we're talking about extending life as an example. There are categories where patients would say, if you can't improve my quality of life, do not extend my life. That is not important to me. We see that in oncology. We've seen that in ALS and other muscular dystrophies. If you can't make my life better, why are you fighting to extend the life? The patients are saying that's not a helpful treatment for me.
We don't understand their life, we can't even begin to start making it better. And that's what's meaningful to them.
Yeah.
So I think just being able to rethink how we understand what they're talking about.
Well, and the flip side of that is there are treatments now coming out. I think we're starting to learn how to quantify quality of life improvement.
Yeah, that's super
right?
important.
And I think you and I were talking about like in pediatric categories like Rett syndrome or AADC deficiency, where a caregiver is the one that's seeing the improvement on a daily basis. They are the only ones that can truly quantify the improvement that they're seeing in their child. The doctor's not seeing them every day. The doctor's not seeing how movement or their ability to connect with their caregiver, how that's improving over time, but the caregiver's feeling it.
Yeah.
So on paper, as a clinical outcome, some people might argue that, no, this is not meaningful improvement. But for that mother who said, my baby showed me that she wanted something, that is huge. That is huge for the way that they live their life.
I think technology in the service of people is what we're in the business of, you know, and so in that sense, there is a role for us to play. I mean, with us being the larger sort of healthcare, you know, pharmaceutical industry creating solutions and healthcare creating pathways and journeys, sort of accelerating, you know, the connection to community. I think there are roles we can play. There are appropriate roles we can play. And I think one of them is the fundamental shift that's underway in how we're treating these diseases. So again, to bring Saketu back up, you know, he was an emergency room doctor, but he originally trained as a geneticist. And he said the reason that many doctors treat the symptoms, so he brought up clubfoot, right? Which I think is a symptom of certain genetic disorders. He goes, there are doctors who can treat a clubfoot, but we didn't look for the underlying etiology because there was nothing to do. It's a waste of time.
Yeah.
It's not a waste of time anymore. We do have treatments that address the underlying etiology. And I think that's the transformation. And for me, again, technology on its own is neither good nor bad. It can do lots of stuff for us, but it does, in the service of good, provide us the opportunity to say we can do more. And even if you don't, even if you only look at clinical outcomes, this is exciting technology for today and for tomorrow. And that's incredibly rare. Typically, you get one or the other. You either get something that's very, very applied that builds off of something that we understand already, or you get something that is theoretically very exciting, but the promise isn't here today. What we have going on right now in rare disease, and I'm going to throw the ball to you in a second, right, is both exciting right now. It's transformative today and tomorrow, because the more we learn about how to repair genetic errors, I don't linguistically, I don't like the word gene editing. It makes it sound like we're experimenting, like let's put a third ear on a monkey or something. Like that's not what we're talking. We're talking about profound repair of the drivers of disorders. That is a fundamental shift. And I think people don't really appreciate how transformative that is. So I just love to give you the platform to talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit.
I think in this day and age, the way that medical technology is advancing, diagnosis is critical, even in the absence of a treatment.
Mm.
And I think now that healthcare professionals are starting to see that there's a socio-emotional benefit for patients to know, because then I can find my community, right?
Mhm.
There's that mental health benefit to find other people like you, but the research benefit, because to your point, now you can diagnose down to the gene. You can have a very specific diagnosis, but that's the key to advancing research in that
Right.
space. Even if there's not a treatment, if we don't have confirmed diagnoses, we're not going to know which gene to be targeting as we're developing treatments. We're testing things out. And we're seeing that shift happen, especially in neurodegenerative spaces. And you're seeing now where it used to be one first and only treatment option, and everyone was saying this is the only thing you can do. And now there's a portfolio of products. There is precision treatments available. It's a very exciting time. I still want to put it in context. There are 7,000 recognized rare
Right.
diseases. About 500 of them have treatments. And if there's 1,000 approved therapies, imagine we've got multiple treatment options in single rare diseases.
Mhm.
That is amazing, but there's still 6,500,
Right.
Yeah.
right? That we haven't really cracked the code on yet. So diagnosis is so important
Yeah.
for a multitude of reasons, but research being a really primary focus.
I think like many cultural transformations, it's driven by technological potential. You know, going all the way back to the agricultural revolution, learning how to plant and harvest created towns. You know, like we don't really know what's happening next, but we know that this technology is transformative, and we know that it's immediately transformative to the patients and the families and the treaters involved in this community. And we know that the potential for it to be transformative is really, we barely scratched the surface. And just to give an example of how fast this is going, I was in graduate school out on the West Coast through the 90s. And that was where the Human Genome Project was going on. So you're not talking that long ago. I'm not that old. It took 10 years to sequence the human genome. It now takes $5.30. right? That's
Mhm.
in my lifetime, in my adult lifetime. I wasn't a kid when I was others, right? So in my adult lifetime, which is shorter than your whole lifetime, we have gone from 10 years to 30 seconds just on being able to sequence the genes. And so if we have that kind of acceleration, the development pathway is being accelerated, the ability to identify a genetic area, right? I don't want to say defect because I
Right,
think
right.
that's stigmatizing as well. But if we can identify the area that needs to be addressed and put something into market that actually addresses it in almost real time. I mean, considering the typical drug development like pathway, this is so fast. It's unbelievable. And I think that's the part that's most exciting. And that's why I'm incredibly excited to have you here, because having someone as the head of the rare disease village who really takes into account the socio-human
Yeah.
as well as the pathophysiological elements of it and the sort of leading science. I don't think there's anything else going on in healthcare that's as exciting in terms of potential, so I'm thrilled you're here, and I'm I don't know where that goes, but
No, I mean, I think we covered so much, and I hope that, and with every discussion that we have, we always invite, a part two and a part three as people listen and find the motivation or the passion to speak about it more. So I think if you currently are doing this work in rare disease, if you want to be, if you have loved ones who suffer from a rare disease, if you do, like, we just want to hear from you. I think with this month specifically, having that focus, we want to just see how can we do better work, how can we continue the conversation. We have these conversations and then sometimes we don't have them enough, so I think giving everyone the opportunity to continue it is really important. Are there any last key takeaways or considerations that you would like to leave our listeners with?
I mean, we talked about such important things. One thing that I just want to reiterate is the resilience of this community and just how impressive it is.
Yep.
The power that an individual, they don't realize they have, but they can impact such incredible change. And I'll leave you with one anecdote of 34-year-old woman who was a patient, received a diagnosis at the age of 34. She found out that she had a rare disease, but that her father did as well. Two of her siblings did, and five of her nieces and nephews had the same rare disease. She could not find another person who had the rare disease. She went on Facebook to vent to
Mhm.
friends and family. And through that, she found and built a community around her disease. And that
Wow.
community then became an advocacy group. The fact that one person turned, almost created a movement
Yeah.
around a rare disease, there really is such strength in numbers and just strength in even the number one.
Yeah,
It has to start somewhere. So
I love that.
really appreciate you guys putting a spotlight on the rare disease community and really showcasing what they've been doing for each other. It's incredibly impressive and really heartwarming.
that's great. I just want to thank Afshan for being here, trying to get it right and model it correctly. And yeah, keep on keeping on.
Yeah.
We'll keep you posted, and you keep us posted on how
Will
it's
do.
going.
Will
But
do.
we're gonna get through to some amazing stuff together, I hope. So,
Yeah, looking forward to it. Welcome.
Thank you.
So, with that said,
Yeah.
I'm Brad Davidson.
I'm Sonika Garcia.
And I'm Afshan Rizvi Hussain.
Until next time, thanks for listening.
Breaking the Code is a podcast created and produced by Havas Health and Use Medical Anthropology Department. Hosted by Brad Davidson and Sonika Garcia. Content and post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration from all of you. Thank you for listening and for your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating, subscribe, and send us a message to our mailbox at medicalanthropology@havas.com. Until next time.